She stood on the porch at 9:50, watching the light above the door, not knowing that in 10 minutes it would go dark and end the date whether she liked it or not. 30 rules ran her whole romance. Nobody wrote them down. Everybody obeyed them. By the middle of the 1950s, American courtship had become its own quiet civilization, with its own laws. Girls carried etiquette guides the way soldiers carried field manuals. Boys learned the rules from older brothers, from coaches, from fathers who walked them through it once and never explained why twice. Amy Vanderbilt published her complete book of etiquette in 1952, and it sat on nightstands next to the family Bible in a lot of houses. This was not casual. This was structure, and structure is what today's video is really about. Long before Amy Vanderbilt put it in print, a sociologist named Willard Waller had already mapped this whole system out. In 1937, he described what he called the rating and dating complex, a competitive scoring system running underneath college courtship, where popularity was tracked as carefully as a batting average. Being seen at the right dance, dating someone with a car, wearing the right pin, all of it counted. The rules were never really about romance alone. They were about status, worn in plain sight. Rule 1. A boy did not simply show up. He telephoned first, and if a father answered, he said his full name before he said anything else. 17 magazine drilled this into a generation of readers starting in 1944 because the first sound a family heard from a suitor was supposed to tell them everything about how he'd been raised. A mumbled hello was a strike against him before he'd even asked for the date. That phone call carried real weight because it was a young man's only audition before he ever set foot in the house. Fathers judged the voice on the other end of the line the way an employer might judge a handshake. Boys practiced what they'd say beforehand, sometimes writing a line or two on a scrap of paper by the phone table. A confident, polite introduction could buy a young man goodwill that lasted through an entire courtship. Rule 2. Many homes still shared a party line, which meant a private call was never really private. Neighbors could pick up and listen. So a boy learned to say less, and to say it carefully, because half the block might be on the other end of that click. It is strange to think a piece of shared wiring shaped how people flirted, but it did. Restraint was not just manners, it was survival. Girls on party lines developed their own code because of it. A kind of shorthand that said everything without saying much at all. A simple, "I'll see you Friday," could carry an entire conversation's worth of meaning if the tone was right. Everyone understood that whatever was said on that line might travel further than intended. So the real conversation often happened later, face-to-face on the porch steps, where at least the only witness was the moth circling the light. Rule 3. The porch light was the real chaperone. Mothers left it burning until their daughter came home, and when it clicked off, that was the signal a date was over, no matter what either of them wanted. A boy learned to read that light the way sailors read a lighthouse. It told him exactly how much time he had and exactly when to say goodnight and mean it. The chaperone had not vanished from American courtship in the 1950s. It had simply changed shape. Instead of a relative sitting in the parlor watching every glance, the job now belonged to architecture and habit. A light switch, a mother waiting up with the radio on low, a house mother checking names off a list. The surveillance was gentler than a generation before, but the function was identical. Someone was always, in some form, keeping watch. Rule 4. Curfew was not a suggestion. Many families and nearly every women's college enforced a strict time, 10 or 11 on a weeknight, midnight if it was a real date. Dormitories kept sign-out sheets. Girls who came in late could be campused, which meant losing off-campus privileges for a week or more. A midnight curfew sounds gentle now. At the time, it was law, and everyone treated it that way. College archives from this era, places like Smith and Wellesley, still hold the actual sign-out ledgers, pages of names and return times in careful handwriting, each one logged by a house mother who took the job seriously. A few minutes late might mean a warning. Repeated lateness could mean a lost weekend of privileges entirely. Students learned to watch the clock the way they watched an exam timer, because the consequence was just as real. Rule 5. The boy paid, every time. The malt shop, the movie ticket, the dance admission, all of it came out of his pocket, and etiquette columns told girls flatly not to offer to split the bill, because it could wound a boy's pride in front of the world. It sounds old-fashioned now. At the time, it was a test. Could he provide, even in a small way, on a soda fountain budget? A part-time job mattered enormously under this rule. A boy bagging groceries or pumping gas after school was not just earning pocket money, he was earning the ability to date at all. Saving for a Friday night out became its own quiet discipline, and etiquette writers understood that. Being able to pay, cleanly and without hesitation, was treated as a small preview of the kind of provider a young man might become down the road. Rule 6. A corsage was not optional for a formal date. A boy bought one, usually $1 or $2, out of an allowance that did not stretch far, and he pinned it himself on the porch while her parents watched and sometimes photographed the moment. That fumbling minute with the pin and the ribbon was practically a rite of passage. Get it wrong, and everyone in the room noticed. Get it right, and you'd earn something. The corsage photograph on the porch became its own tradition inside the tradition. Families kept a camera loaded and ready every prom night, and that single snapshot, boy and girl standing stiffly by the front door, often ended up in a scrapbook that outlived the relationship itself by decades. Decades later, women would pull out those pages to show a granddaughter, not because the romance lasted, but because the ritual itself was worth remembering. Rule 7. Walking on the outside of the sidewalk was not a suggestion, it was reflex. A gentleman kept himself between the lady and the street, a habit inherited from horse and buggy days when a passing carriage could splash mud on a good dress. There were no carriages left by the 1950s. The rule stayed anyway, because it had stopped being about mud and started being about attention. It said, "I am watching out for you," without saying a word. Etiquette manuals of the decade were full of these fossils. Small physical gestures whose original purpose had disappeared generations earlier, but whose symbolic value had only grown stronger. A hat tipped to a passing lady. A hand offered stepping down from a curb that barely had a step. None of it was about function by the 1950s. All of it was about a language of care that people had agreed to keep speaking, even after the original reason for the words was long gone. Rule 8. A girl did not call a boy first. Etiquette writers were blunt about it. A girl who rang a boy's house risked looking desperate, or, worse, forward, and that reputation could follow her through an entire school year. So she waited. She might sit by the phone on a Friday evening, hoping it would ring, and she was expected to look like she wasn't waiting at all. There were quiet workarounds to this rule, and girls of the era learned them well. A friend might mention offhand at school that a certain girl would be at the roller rink Saturday, a message passed along without ever technically breaking the no-calling rule. It was a whole diplomatic system built to get around a restriction nobody was allowed to openly ignore. Proof that even a rigid rule left room for cleverness if you knew exactly where its edges were. Rule 9. Going steady had a uniform, and everyone could read it. A boy's ID bracelet on her wrist, his class ring wound with Angora yarn so it wouldn't slide off her smaller finger. His leather jacket draped over her shoulders at a football game. None of it needed a caption. Walk down any high school hallway in 1955, and you could read who belonged to whom just by looking at what people were wearing. That Angora-wrapped ring was practically an engineering project. A girl would spend an evening winding soft yarn around the band until it fit snugly enough not to spin on her finger, and the color of the yarn sometimes matched her sweater on purpose. It was a small act of craftsmanship built entirely around making someone else's symbol fit her own hand. A detail that says something quiet about how much personal effort went into wearing another person's commitment. Rule 10. Pinning was a real ceremony, not just a phrase. A fraternity man would give his pin to the girl he intended to marry, and that night her sorority sisters would gather in a candlelit circle, singing, passing the flame hand to hand. When the candle reached her and she blew it out, everyone in the room understood without being told. Some houses even had the fraternity brothers serenade from the lawn below the windows the same evening. The candle itself carried a code within the code. In some houses, blowing it out on the first pass meant simply pinned, going steady with real intention behind it. Blowing it out on the third pass around, the circle signaled something bigger, an engagement. Sisters counted silently as the flame traveled, and by the time it reached the girl in question, half the room already had a good guess at the news before she ever said a word. Rule 11. Breaking up had its own ceremony too, and it was almost never quiet. Giving back the pin was the phrase, and people meant it literally, mailed in an envelope, or handed across a diner table in front of everyone. Because pinning had been so public, the undoing had to be just as visible. Word traveled through a school in a single afternoon, once a ring or a pin changed hands again. There was an unofficial etiquette to how you gave the pin back, too. A mailed envelope with no note was read as cold, almost punishing. Handing it back in person, even briefly, was considered the more respectful path, however painful the conversation. Some girls kept the pin box the ring had originally come in and used it to return everything neatly, a small final courtesy that said, whatever else happened, I still respected what this once meant. Rule 12. Letters had a grammar of their own, and everyone who wrote one knew it. You closed a letter to a beau with sincerely at first, then maybe affectionately once things warmed, and love was a word you did not spend carelessly. Moving from one closing to the next was an announcement, quiet but unmistakable, and the person receiving that letter would have noticed the change before they'd finished the first line. This mattered most for couples separated by distance, a college student home for the summer, or a serviceman writing from a base far from his sweetheart. With no phone call possible every night, a letter was often the entire relationship for weeks at a time. People read those pages over and over, studying not just what was written but how it was signed, because a single word at the bottom of a page could carry a whole conversation's worth of feeling across hundreds of miles. Rule 13. A steady couple often had a booth. At the local diner or soda fountain, the same corners, the same seats, week after week, until other kids simply left it open without being asked. It was never announced or reserved. It just became understood, the way a church pew belongs to a family without anyone putting a name on it. That small, unspoken courtesy told you everything about how public going steady really was. The jukebox played its own quiet role in all this. A couple often had a song, dropped into the machine so many Friday nights running that the waitress could practically predict it before the coin hit the slot. Years later, hearing that same tune on the radio could stop a woman cold in the middle of a grocery aisle. The whole booth and the whole decade rushing back in the space of 4 bars of music. Rule 14. Father still had a moment that mattered. Even without the old Victorian calling card, a boy was expected to introduce himself to whichever parent opened the door, look them in the eye, and state plainly why he was there. It did not need to be a formal interrogation. But skipping it, slipping past the front hall to whisk a girl out the side door, was noticed, and it cost a boy standing he rarely got back easily. It is worth clearing up a common mix-up here. People often picture a Victorian gentleman leaving an engraved calling card on a silver tray and assume that was still standard practice in the 1950s. It was not. That formal card had faded out decades earlier. What replaced it was simpler and just as effective, a polite phone call and a face-to-face greeting at the door. Proof that etiquette evolves even while its underlying purpose, showing respect before taking someone's daughter out, stays exactly the same. Rule 15. Going steady was not supposed to start too young, and plenty of adults said so out loud. Ministers, teachers, and etiquette columnists worried openly when 8th and 9th graders started wearing rings meant for seniors. Some schools actually banned steady dating symbols on campus for a stretch, class rings and letter jackets confiscated at the door. The rules people now remember as timeless were, at the time, being argued over constantly. Local newspapers of the decade sometimes ran opinion pieces from worried parents or school administrators, debating whether steady dating at 14 and 15 was healthy at all, or whether it robbed young people of the chance to simply date around and figure out what they wanted. It is easy to imagine the 1950s as a single unified code everyone agreed on without question. In truth, the rules were being argued over at kitchen tables and school board meetings the entire time. Rule 16. Not every teenager had a car, and this mattered more than people remember. Plenty of early and mid-decade dates depended on a father driving or an older sibling with a license tagging along on a reluctant double date. The car-centered date, the drive-in movie, the joyride to the malt shop, became common later in the decade as car ownership spread. Before that, courtship often moved at the pace of whoever in the family owned the keys. Father driving his daughter and her date to the movies was its own small institution, complete with its own etiquette. The boy sat up front making conversation with the father, while the girl sat quietly in back, and everyone understood the ride. There was really an extended version of the doorstep introduction, one more chance for a father to size up the young man before handing over 2 hours of unsupervised time inside a darkened theater. Rule 17. By the late 50s, drive-in theaters had become one of the biggest date destinations in the country, and there were more than 4,000 of them scattered across America. They came with their own quiet debate. Privacy for a couple wrapped inside a rule about how much privacy was appropriate. Parents worried. Teenagers went anyway. The drive-in became a kind of frontier where the old rules had to stretch to cover something new. Some drive-ins printed their own gentle house rules right on the ticket stub or the marquee: no headlight flashing, no honking, and an unspoken expectation of decent behavior everyone understood without a sign spelling it out. Because the drive-in blurred the line between public and private in a way no soda fountain booth ever could, the community adjusted its watching, not by adding chaperones, but by trusting that thousands of nearby cars, all facing the same screen, were witness enough. Rule 18. A young man walked a girl to her door and waited until she was safely inside before he left. Not a wave from the car, not a honk from the curb, the full walk up the path every time. It cost him a few extra minutes on every single date across a school year, minutes that added up to something real, a habit so consistent it became the whole definition of being a gentleman in a town's eyes. Rule 19. A first date almost never happened alone. Double dating was the standard opening move: 2 couples, 1 car, safety in numbers, and witnesses built right in. It gave a nervous boy backup if the conversation stalled, and it gave a girl the comfort of a friend a few feet away. Only after several outings did a couple graduate to being alone together, and that graduation was its own small milestone everyone quietly tracked. Best friends often served as unofficial matchmakers inside this double date system, pairing off a shy classmate with someone they thought might suit, then quietly stepping back once the two seemed comfortable. A whole friendship group could get invested in whether a particular pairing worked out. Cheering it along the way, people now root for a couple on a reality show. Except this was happening in real backyards, at real bonfires, among people who had known each other since grade school. Rule 20. A boy opened every door: the car door, the restaurant door, the theater door, and he did it without being asked, because being asked would have meant he'd failed to notice in the first place. Etiquette guides treated this as basic as tying a shoe. It was practiced so often it stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like instinct, which was exactly the point of drilling a rule until nobody has to think about it anymore. Rule 21. A girl was taught to let the boy lead the plans, the timing, the destination, even when she had opinions of her own. Etiquette columns framed this as gracious rather than passive, a way of letting a young man practice being decisive without an audience correcting him at every turn. It was a rule that asked a great deal of restraint from her, and it rarely got named as restraint out loud. In practice, plenty of girls found quiet ways to shape a date without ever taking the wheel outright. A well-placed comment about loving a particular band playing downtown, or mentioning a friend who'd raved about a new diner could steer a boy's plans in exactly the direction she wanted, while still leaving him feeling like the plan had been entirely his own idea. It was influence wearing the costume of passivity, and plenty of women who lived it later admitted it took real skill. Rule 22. A first date ended with a handshake, or at most a quick goodnight, nothing more, and any earlier than the third or fourth outing, a kiss was considered forward enough to change how a boy saw a girl the next day at school. Etiquette writers were explicit that a girl's reputation could hinge on pacing alone, not on anything scandalous, simply on moving faster than the unwritten schedule allowed. This is one of the areas historians point to as more performed than practiced universally. Studies from the period itself suggest actual behavior often ran ahead of what etiquette columns prescribed, but the public schedule mattered anyway, because reputation was built on what was seen and repeated, not necessarily on what happened in private. A girl who was discreet could live one way and be perceived another, and in a small town the perception was often what counted most. Rule 23. Thank you notes were expected after a formal date, especially a dance or a dinner at someone's family home. A girl might send a short card to a boy's mother thanking her for raising a gentleman, and a boy might send flowers or a note the next day. It was a small ritual, but skipping it read as carelessness, and carelessness in courtship was the one thing nobody in this system could afford to be caught doing. A note to a boy's mother was considered especially important, since it acknowledged the household that had raised him, not just the young man himself. Mothers of the era genuinely kept these cards tucked into a drawer or a scrapbook alongside birthday cards and school photos, small proof that a girl her son was seeing understood the full shape of good manners, not just the version aimed directly at him. Rule 24. A girl dressed for the occasion without exception, a hat and gloves for church socials, a full skirt, and pressed blouse even for a casual malt shop outing. Looking careless was read as not taking the boy, or the relationship, seriously. Mothers checked hemlines and stocking seams before a daughter left the house, because a wrinkled outfit could become the thing people talked about, instead of the couple themselves. Boys had their own version of this inspection, even if it got less attention in the etiquette columns aimed at girls. A pressed shirt, polished shoes, hair combed just so with a bit of pomade, all checked in the hallway mirror on the way out the door, sometimes under a mother's watchful eye as well. Looking put together was never framed as vanity in this era. It was framed as respect, proof that you had taken the evening and the person you were meeting seriously. Rule 25. Gossip traveled the halls faster than any newspaper, and etiquette manuals actually addressed this directly, warning readers never to discuss a date's private conversation with friends the next day. A confided secret repeated at a lunch table could unravel a relationship inside a week. The rule was less about secrecy for its own sake and more about trust, proof that a person could be told something and not turn it into currency for popularity. Rule 26. Engagement itself followed a script. A ring, a formal announcement, often printed in the local newspaper society pages with the bride's name, her parents' names, and sometimes her father's occupation listed beside it. Families treated the announcement almost like a public contract, because in a sense it was a whole town learning at once that two people had moved from going steady into something the community now expected to see through. Once that announcement ran, calling off an engagement became a genuinely difficult thing to do socially, not because anyone would forbid it, but because so many people now knew. Neighbors asked about the wedding date at the grocery store. Distant relatives sent congratulations by mail. The public nature of the announcement, which had felt celebratory at first, could quietly become its own kind of pressure to see the thing through, whatever doubts crept in privately. Rule 27. A young man was expected to ask a father's blessings before proposing, a private conversation that happened away from the daughter entirely. It was not usually a dramatic scene. Often it was a quiet exchange in a den or on a porch, a handshake sealing it more than any speech did. But skipping this step, proposing without ever having that conversation, was considered a real breach, one families sometimes never fully let go of. Rule 28. By the middle of the decade, the median age American women married for the first time had fallen to about 20 years old, the lowest point of the entire century. That number tells you how fast this whole system was designed to move: calling, going steady, pinning, engagement, marriage, often compressed into just a few short years. What felt leisurely in memory was, at the time, closer to a fast-moving conveyor belt everyone stepped onto early. It helps to see that timeline laid out side by side. A girl might start going steady at 16, be pinned by 18, engaged by 19, and married before her 21st birthday, each stage lasting only months rather than years. Compressed like that, the whole system reads less like a slow romance novel and more like a schedule everyone had quietly agreed to keep, one clear step following the last, without much room to linger. Rule 29. A boy's reputation could be built or ruined by how he treated a girl's family, not just the girl herself. Rudeness to a mother, forgetting a father's name, arriving without a proper greeting, these were remembered and repeated at church, at the barber shop, at the grocery store. Courtship in a small or mid-sized town in the 1950s was never really private between two people. It played out in front of an entire community that kept score. Church played its own quiet part in this network of watching. Sunday services were often the one place an entire town's worth of families gathered in the same room every single week, which meant a courting couple sitting together in a pew, or a boy walking a girl's family to their car afterward, became a small public performance repeated on a reliable schedule. It reinforced the same lesson every other rule taught, that a relationship in this era was communal property as much as it was personal. Rule 30. Every one of these rules, the phone call, the porch light, the corsage, the pin, the walk to the door, pointed at the same idea. Commitment had to be visible, or it did not fully count. A feeling kept entirely private was treated as unfinished, almost suspicious. Love, in this system, was something you were supposed to prove in front of other people, again and again, in small physical gestures everyone could see and recognize. It is worth pausing on why that visibility mattered so much in the first place. Without the instant communication we take for granted now, a phone in every pocket, a photo shared in seconds, a public gesture was often the only reliable way information about a relationship spread at all. Wearing a boy's jacket at a football game was, in a very real sense, the 1950s version of a public relationship status, seen once, understood by everyone, and rarely needing to be repeated. None of this was as simple as it looked from the outside. Historians and even studies from that same period found that private behavior often ran ahead of the public code, that the rules were as much an ideal to perform as a strict record of what everyone actually did. So hold both truths at once. The etiquette was real, and it was also, in part, a performance everyone agreed to keep giving. It is worth saying plainly, some of this structure came at a real cost. The roles were narrow. A girl's whole calendar could bend around waiting for a call, waiting for a ring, waiting for a light to click off. That is not something to romanticize without noticing. But the instinct underneath it, that a relationship deserves clear signals and visible stages, is not a flaw. That part is worth understanding, even now. Women who lived through this era, looking back decades later, often describe it with more nuance than either side of today's argument allows. Some remember the waiting with real frustration, the sense that so much of their romantic life depended on someone else's initiative. Others remember the clarity fondly, knowing exactly what a gesture meant without having to guess. Both memories can be true of the same decade, sometimes even of the same woman on different days. By the middle of the 1960s, most of this had started to loosen. Curfews eased. Parietal hours at colleges came down. Pinning ceremonies grew rarer as fewer students joined fraternities and sororities the way earlier classes had. The rules this video just walked through were not eternal. They were the product of one specific stretch of years, tightly held while they lasted, and then let go within a single generation. The Food and Drug Administration's approval of the birth control pill in 1960 is often cited as one of the slow-moving forces behind that shift, though its real cultural impact unfolded gradually across the decade rather than overnight. Combined with campus unrest and a broader questioning of authority in the mid to late 60s, the entire structure of chaperones, curfews, and public rituals lost its footing within roughly 10 years of its peak. Today, dating looks almost nothing like this. There is no porch light, no pin, no candle passed hand to hand. Surveys of daters in recent years have described real fatigue with modern apps, the endless ambiguity of a talking stage that never quite becomes anything. Maybe that is why these old rules keep resurfacing online. Not because people want father's permission back, but because they miss knowing exactly where they stand with someone. You can see the same hunger for clarity showing up now in small revivals, promise rings mentioned again in pop culture conversation, couples on social media proudly narrating exactly what stage their relationship is in, a kind of digital pinning ceremony without the candle. The tools have changed completely. The underlying wish, to know clearly and be known clearly, has not moved an inch since the diner booth and the corsage box. It is also worth remembering the vintage lifestyle wave sweeping through social media. In recent years, the renewed interest in slower living, structured domestic rituals, defined roles some people find comforting to study even if they would not choose to live inside them permanently. That interest is not really about wanting the 1950s back wholesale. It is about borrowing the parts that feel like relief, structure, and clarity without pretending the rest of the era was simple or easy. That is the real inheritance of all 30 rules, not the specific gestures themselves, but the certainty underneath them. A pin meant something. A returned ring meant something. A porch light going dark meant the night was over and everyone understood why. Whatever you think of the era's limits, that clarity is what so many people are quietly reaching back for today, one candlelit ceremony and one careful phone call at a time. If you found one of these 30 rules as strange or as strangely comforting, as I did the first time I read it, tell me which one down in the comments. Was it the porch light, the candle ceremony, the Angora-wrapped ring? I read every single one, and I love hearing which rule surprised you most. I'll be back next week with another forgotten piece of how our grandparents actually fell in love, another courtship rule pulled out of an old etiquette book and dusted off for you. Until then, take care of each other and maybe leave the porch light on for someone.